Okay, how's it going, everybody? Today we're going to talk about the life and times of William Penn. First thing I'm going to do is give you a little bit of background into Penn's early life. Then we're really going to focus on the founding of Pennsylvania and his time here in America, which is actually very complex and very nuanced, so we'll get into a little bit of that. And then we're going to wrap it up with Penn's turbulent life after he returned to England. So when I give these talks, generally the first thing I like to do is kind of talk about some of the things that are associated with the person that I'm talking about. And with William Penn, it is pretty much endless. There are so many things that are named after him and associated with him. So here you can see some statues. The one on the left is on top of City Hall. The one in the center is where is Welcome Park. That's where William Penn lived for a little while. And then you have here the one on the right, which is in Newcastle, Delaware. So you can see here there's a bank named after William Penn. There's a hotel named after William Penn. We also have the William Penn Inn. We have the William Penn University. Obviously, he named Philadelphia. The city of Chester, he also named, it used to be called Upland. Wilmington, Delaware is not named by William Penn, but it is named by was named by Thomas Penn, his son, after Spencer Compton, the first Earl of Wilmington. Of course, you have Pennsville, which is from the Penn name, and Penn's Landing, and there's also tons of other towns that are named after Penn. And there's even a William Penn gas can, which I think is pretty cool. So despite all that, a lot of people don't really know a lot about William Penn. They think, well, he was a Quaker, he founded Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, and isn't he the guy on the Quaker Oats box? Which there is some controversy with that. The company has said that yes, he is, and then other times they've retracted that and said that no, he isn't. So in order to talk about William Penn, we have to briefly start to talk about this man. This is not William Penn. This is William Penn's father, Admiral William Penn. He was born in 1621 and was in the English Navy. In that capacity, he served in the First English Civil War, the First Anglo-Dutch War, and he had a small role in the restoration of King Charles II to the throne. Admiral Penn was knighted and served in the House of Commons for a decade. So the big takeaway here is that Admiral Penn was very closely associated with King Charles II. And by that association, he was associated with the Church of England, which was the religion in England at the time. This is going to become very important later when we talk about his son and namesake, the young William Penn, who converts to Quakerism. So now let's talk about William Penn, his son. William Penn was born on October 24th, 1644 in Ruscombe, England, to Admiral Penn and Margaret Jasper. When William was just 4 years old, he caught smallpox and nearly died. It is said that he lost a lot of his hair and was forced to wear wigs the rest of his life, although that's not totally been proven. He was probably treated with mercury for this, which might have caused him to lose his hair. At the age of 9, William was sent to Chigwell, which was essentially today's equivalent of a grammar school. However, he was taken out of that school when the Penn family moved to Ireland for a brief period of time. While in Ireland at the age of 14, William would have a life-changing moment where he met Quaker preacher Thomas Lowe and listened to him speak. This meeting left a significant impression on William, and at the time, he wrote that God had visited him personally. This moment in his life would essentially be the beginning of his spiritual journey into the Society of Friends, or what we know them as Quakers. When William was 15 years old, he was sent to Oxford University to receive an education. This is where William begins to, quote unquote, act up. He took an extreme dislike to the authoritarian ways of the Church of England, and he was very sensitive to the people who were oppressed. William refused to attend church services, and he was disciplined by the university. So this would cause William's father to remove William from Oxford to essentially save him from the embarrassment. And they sent him off to France in hope that he would be changed. So there are conflicting accounts of whether William was removed from Oxford by his father or he was actually expelled. It's a little bit unclear on that. So William Penn goes to France expecting to be changed, and he was not changed. Although his time in France had given him some refinement and he had developed a taste for some of the finer things in life, it did nothing to change his views on the Church of England, and it was likely in France where William became even more interested in religious tolerance when he interacted with the French Huguenots. It was also very clear from this point forward that William Penn was going to kind of march to the beat of a different drum. And here you can see him. He's in his armor, and this is just before he's going to convert to Quakerism. So William returns to England, and he meets with the founder of Quakerism, George Fox, who you can see right here. And William Penn officially becomes a Quaker in 1667. By converting to Quakerism, William was taking a huge risk. Not only was he going against the Church of England, but he was also going against the King of England, who oppressed Quakers. William's father, Admiral Penn, was so upset over this news that he beat William, threw him out of the house, and threatened to disinherit him from his will. Here, Admiral Penn had hoped his firstborn son and namesake was going to follow in his footsteps, but by young William Penn converting to Quakerism, that was all in jeopardy. So William Penn decided to go a step further by publishing pamphlets arguing against not just the king, but the Church of England. William Penn was arrested for this, essentially persecuted for his beliefs. While he was in prison, he published a book called No Cross, No Crown, which again was against the king and the Church of England. Penn refused to recant and said he was willing to die in prison for his beliefs, which is something that perhaps can be admired. He was so strong in his beliefs that he was willing to just rot in prison. Penn was eventually released, but would continue to face threats of arrest for preaching in public. In 1670, Admiral Penn, his father, was on his deathbed. The young William came to his side, and although Admiral Penn had, of course, disagreed with his son's conversion to Quakerism, he admired his conviction. Father and son made peace just before the Admiral's death, and although there had been earlier threats to disinherit William Penn, it never happened. There are also some accounts that say Admiral Penn wrote a letter to King Charles II, basically telling the king to give his son grace in his beliefs. Whether the letter was written or not, it is without question that Admiral Penn and his relationship to the king had an influence on the upcoming founding of Pennsylvania. In 1672, William Penn would marry Gulielma Springett, and the couple would go on to have 7 children. Sadly, 5 of those 7 children would not live to see their 3rd birthday. One of his sons was named William Penn Jr., who we are going to talk a little bit more about later. In 1677, William Penn took some of his inheritance that he got from his father, and along with other Quakers, he bought West Jersey in America. So now he's starting to establish a foothold in what would later be America. At the time, the state of New Jersey was divided into East and West Jersey. Obviously, today we think of it as North, Central, and South Jersey, but then it was East and West Jersey. This wasn't a huge commitment for Penn, but it did give him his first taste of land ownership. In 1681, William Penn petitioned and was granted land from King Charles II, and this would become Pennsylvania. It was said that the land was given to William Penn after the debt King Charles owed his father, Admiral Penn, and while the debt did in fact exist, the king was actually under no legal obligation to pay it. After all, he's the king, he can kind of do what he wants. So it's also likely that King Charles II just wanted to colonize the area and felt that William Penn would be a good guy to do it. So Charles was kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone here, so to speak. He was satisfying a debt, and he was colonizing the area. Here you can see the depiction of William Penn presenting his petition to King Charles II. William Penn wanted his new colony to be a holy experiment where the Quakers and others could go for religious tolerance and be free from oppression. But there was, of course, an ulterior motive to all of this, and that was money. William Penn was never great with his money, and as you will see, he found himself in constant debt later in life. He would overspend, and it was hard for him to get out of debt. And so at this time, he was hoping that this venture would help him out financially. So this guy here, most people don't know him, but he has a lot more of an influence over Pennsylvania than one might think. This is Leo Lyon Jenkins, and he was somebody who worked. He was like a secretary for King Charles II. And so originally, William Penn wanted to name Pennsylvania New Wales. And so he submitted that, and Leo Lyon Jenkins, who was Welsh, said, absolutely not. It's not going to happen. And he basically shot that down. So William Penn resubmitted and said he wanted to name it Slivania, which stands for the woods. And Leo Lyon Jenkins said, okay, Slovenia will work, but in memory of your father, we are going to add Penn to the front of that, so it becomes Pennsylvania. And William Penn hated that because he was a Quaker and he didn't want to be thought of as putting his name on the place that he owned. But King Charles II essentially insisted that that's what it would be, and that's what it ended up being. So William Penn got to work on signing land grants to Quakers to colonize the area, and he hired a surveyor whose name was Thomas Holme to create a map of all the land plots. Here you can see the map of all the land that was later released in 1687. William Penn also had plans for a huge city in his colony. In 1681, William Penn sent his cousin William Markham to choose the land not only for the city of Philadelphia, but also for William Penn's future homestead, which would be called Pennsbury. So in a letter to William Markham dated October 28, 1681, Penn mentions the name of the city for the first time. Philadelphia is derived from Philadelphos, which is Greek for the city of brotherly love. Now, Penn's cousin William Markham probably doesn't get enough recognition for his role in founding the Pennsylvania colony. However, they did paint a mural of him, and here it is, and it's at a post office in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and this kind of shows him purchasing some land from the Native Americans in July 1682 before William Penn would have arrived. This was July 15th when he purchased land that would basically later become modern-day Bucks County. William Penn himself set sail aboard the Welcome in August 1682 to travel to America. Penn left his entire family in England, but he had hoped to send for them later. It was Penn's intention to basically spend the rest of his life in the colony. Just before Penn leaves England, he also gets a grant from James, the Duke of York, to settle what is called the Lower Counties. The reason Penn wants this land is because he wants access to the sea. The only land that James retains is a 12-mile circle around the town of Newcastle, which is still kind of there to this day. James is the brother of King Charles II, and William Penn and King James II are good friends. And this friendship that they have actually becomes important later on. William Penn arrives in Newcastle on the 28th of October, 1682. There are conflicting accounts of whether Penn actually got off the ship. One account comes from John Mole, who was a witness to Penn landing in Newcastle, but this account was written decades after the landing. In it, Mole says that Penn merely stayed on the ship and he only sent an assistant ashore. However, there's another account by a man named Philip Ford. Now, Ford wasn't actually present at the landing, but he summarized an abstract of a lost letter from William Penn. And in that account, he said that Penn did in fact get off the ship and gave a speech at the Newcastle County Courthouse, and that he held a brief ceremony. You can kind of see the picture there of the ceremony in the left. And of course the statue that we talked about, which is in Newcastle, dedicating the landing. So whether he got off the ship or whether he didn't get off the ship, we don't know. In any event, he definitely got off the ship in Upland, Pennsylvania, and from there he traveled to the future site of Philadelphia. Once he was in America, Penn continued to work to establish his colony for the next 2 years. Here you can see William Penn landing in Philadelphia, and you have the welcome ship in the background, and you have the Blue Anchor Tavern, which might not have been there at the time of his landing, so it's a little bit anachronistic, but you get the idea. All right, so by early 1684, now this is 2 years after William Penn had landed, there are some positives and there are some negatives. Penn had bought land and established peaceful relationships with the Native Americans, so that was positive. Land settlement was a success, and the city of Philadelphia began to thrive. There were now 250 houses, or something like that, in that area. Frame government had been established, basically establishing the laws of the land in 1683. So it's this last one, the frame government, that I want to talk about a little bit, because it does sort of dictate the remainder of William Penn's association with the Pennsylvania colony. So you can kind of see here, and this is from credit to Pennsbury Manor, they laid all this out. You can kind of see here you have the King of England that gives the authority to William Penn, the proprietor, who then delegates authority down to the governor, and the governor answers to the Provincial Council and the Pennsylvania Assembly, and then of course you have the citizens of the colony that speak to the Provincial Council and the Pennsylvania Assembly. This is sort of similar a little bit to how things are set up in the United States today, with the House and the Senate. So while we have good things happening in the colony, there are also some challenges. There are some land disputes happening that William Penn is getting bogged down with. Penn oversold his land and is having to deal with that in various different ways. His surveyor, Thomas Holm, which I talked about, was accused of being an alcoholic. And also, while Philadelphia was supposed to be this huge city, the land for it ends up being rather small, which is still holds true to this day. Another challenge is the colony was not profitable, and the money that Penn received from selling the land was not enough to cover his expenses, and Penn quickly began having financial issues. And Penn was also having disputes with Lord Baltimore on where the 40th parallel was and who owned what land. So now, this last point here, we are going to focus a little bit more on this because it's going to have major implications down the road. So to properly address this last point, we need to go back 50 years to 1632. So this is going to be 12 years before William Penn is even born. In 1632, King Charles I, not the second, but the first, granted land to the Americas to a man named George Calvert, who was the first Baron of Baltimore. However, before George Calvert could take possession of this land, he died, and the land passed to his son, Cecil Calvert, the second Baron of Baltimore. So here you can see King Charles I and George Calvert, and there is his son, Cecil Calvert, who is getting the land. So the land is going to be named after King Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria, and it's going to be called Maryland. Cecil Calvert dispatches his brother Leonard Calvert and other Catholic settlers to Maryland, and they arrive aboard the ships, the Ark and the Dove, at St. Clement's Island on March 25th, 1634, and they begin to settle the area. All right, so now let's fast forward 50 years. King Charles I is dead. He's beheaded in 1649, and as mentioned before, his son King Charles II is now in power. You see him over here on the left. And Cecil Calvert has also passed away, dying in 1675, and Maryland has now passed to his son Charles Calvert, who you can see over here on the right, and he is the third Baron of Baltimore It is sometimes tough keeping all these Baron Baltimores straight. There are actually 6 of them, believe it or not. Anyway, there is very quickly becoming a dispute between the Penns and the Calverts over who owns what land, with everyone wondering exactly where the 40th parallel dividing line is. This is where the dispute comes to the Delaware area. There is a man by the name of George Talbot, who is actually the cousin of the 3rd Lord Baltimore. Talbot is dispatched to the area of Iron Hill on the Maryland-Delaware border, and he's actually told to run off Penn settlers in the area. There is actually an account from a man by the name of Joseph Bowles, who lived near Iron Hill, who said that Talbot appeared and basically cursed him out and forced him to get off his own land under the threat of arrest. Talbot then goes to the present day town of Christiana, and builds a fort, which is a direct provocation to William Penn. If you know where the Red Robin is on Route 273 today, there's actually a marker for Talbot's fort. A lot of people don't know this marker exists, nor do they know, as you will see, how much this fort actually had a direct influence on William Penn's life after 1684. With the fort being built, it soon becomes apparent that this land dispute between the Penns and the Calverts is going to have to be settled back in court in England before it turns into an armed conflict, something that the Quakers were against. So William Penn sends his cousin William Markham to England to fight the battle in early 1684. However, the 3rd Baron of Baltimore, Charles Calvert, heads back to England to fight the battle in person, and Markham soon sends a letter to Penn in Pennsylvania that Penn is going to have to come back to England to be there in person. So in the summer of 1684, William Penn leaves Pennsylvania to travel back to England. Some authors will later say that Penn leaving the colony at this time was the greatest mistake of his life. Penn arrives back in England and busies himself with preparing his case against Lord Baltimore. In February 1685, King Charles II passes away, and he's replaced by his brother, the Duke of York, who becomes King James II. This works to the advantage of William Penn because, as we discussed earlier, William and James are good friends. King James rules in favor of Penn in the Penn-Calvert dispute, despite it being established that the 40th parallel is actually north of Philadelphia. James rules that the grant for Calvert's land only covered uncultivated land. Since some of the area has been settled by the Dutch prior to the Calvert land grant, it was exempt. Despite Penn's victory over Calvert, trouble lay ahead for Penn and the colony of Pennsylvania. In Penn's absence from the colony, a man by the name of Thomas Lloyd was put in charge as the governor of Pennsylvania. Lloyd's loyalty to the Quakers put him at odds with landowners that were not Quaker. Lloyd was especially at odds with many of the diverse groups in the lower counties. The lower counties felt that the Quaker Assembly in Philadelphia had too much power. Fed up with the turmoil, William Penn appointed John Blackwell as governor, a Puritan from New England. Blackwell was immediately resisted by Thomas Lloyd and the Quaker community in Philadelphia. In a funny quote from Blackwell, he actually shows up in Philadelphia expecting this huge welcoming committee, but instead he just finds kids laughing at him in the street. The seal to approve documents was kept by Thomas Lloyd, rendering Blackwell essentially powerless. Blackwell's time as governor only lasted a year. In an attempt to pacify the lower counties, Penn had Thomas Lloyd reappointed in Philadelphia, but appointed a non-Quaker, his cousin William Markham, to the lower counties. William Markham then becomes essentially the first governor of Delaware. Around this time, Penn's letters to the colony had become more demanding and authoritative. What started as a holy experiment in Pennsylvania was quickly devolving into nothing more than land speculation and power struggles between Quakers and non-Quakers. Penn was also personally hurt by the fact that the colony of Pennsylvania didn't raise any money to send to him, nor did they desire his return to the colony that he had founded. And eventually, many of the citizens in Pennsylvania came to see Penn as nothing more than an absentee proprietor. So while all this chaos is ensuing in the Pennsylvania colony, Penn faced his own issues back in England. In 1688, King James II was deposed during the Glorious Revolution, and William and Mary took to the throne. Since Penn had been a friend of King James II and had been so loyal to him, Penn was now considered essentially a traitor by William and Mary. So basically, the enemy of my enemy is now my enemy. In the early 1690s, Penn, fearing arrest for treason, went into hiding in England because of the chaos in his colony, his refusal to tax the colony, and his refusal to raise a militia for an army for any type of defense. William and Mary stripped Penn of the colony in 1692. They put a man by the name of Benjamin Fletcher in charge as governor of Pennsylvania. Now, Penn was able to get his colony back in 1694 after promising to tax the colony and raise a militia. One of the few times that Penn went against his Quaker beliefs. Penn was also able to somewhat convince William and Mary that he was loyal, and he was able to avoid arrest and come out of hiding. But just as things are looking more promising for Penn, tragically, his wife, Gulielma, passes away on February 23rd, 1694, at the age of 50. The couple had been very close, and her death devastated Penn. 2 years later, William Penn is beginning to rebuild his life. In 1696, Penn remarried, this time to Hannah Callowhill. She was just 25, and Penn was 52. Despite the age gap, the couple did manage to get along. They would go on to have numerous children, including Thomas, John, and Richard. Finally, in 1699, after 18 years away from his colony, Penn was ready to return to Pennsylvania with the intention of living the rest of his life there. This time, Penn brought his family with him. Penn arrived in Philadelphia in late 1699 and found that things had significantly changed since he had left. Despite all the chaos that had taken place while he was gone, Penn's colony had flourished and thrived. Philadelphia was now a bustling city. Penn briefly took up residence at the now-built slate roof house in Philadelphia, but moved to his now-finished manor house in Pennsbury, which was located just south of present-day city of Trenton. While in his colony, Penn wrote the Charter of Privileges. It really was a groundbreaking document. It provided for a democratic government, that the people had a say in their government. It provided for religious tolerance, equity, and provided citizens with property rights. If this sounds familiar, a lot of the ideas were later used when the United States of America was founded. In 1751, on the 50th anniversary of the document, a bell was made to commemorate the Charter of Privileges. It was hung in Philadelphia but wasn't cast correctly, and it developed a crack, and of course we know that today as the Liberty Bell. Unfortunately, the lower counties did not really agree with Pennsylvania's Charter of Privileges unless they had an equal number of seats in the assembly. This was not acceptable, and the lower counties essentially formed their own assembly and broke away from Pennsylvania. However, they did remain under the proprietorship of William Penn. On a more local Delaware note, in 1701, William Penn also granted 30,000 acres to the Welsh who settled in the area of Pencader. There are a few markers up on Iron Hill today which talk about this. Sadly, Penn's stay in the colony was short-lived. Fearing that he again might lose the colony to royal authority, Penn was forced to return to England. In the fall of 1701, William Penn packed up his family and again returned to England. Although he would continue to plan to return to the colony over the next decade, this would actually be the last time that Penn ever set foot in Pennsylvania. Immediately upon returning to England, William Penn faced a massive problem. Philip Ford, Penn's accountant, passed away, and it was soon discovered that Ford had been embezzling a ton of William Penn's money. To make matters worse, it was also discovered that William Penn didn't even actually own the colony of Pennsylvania, having sold it in 1697 to Ford. Some say he accidentally did this by signing a document without reading it. Others say that Penn was in such bad financial shape that he sold the colony on purpose. Either way, Philip's widow, Bridget Ford, was planning to challenge Penn's ownership of the colony in court, and Penn raced to try to sell Pennsylvania back to the Crown of England before Bridget was able to take ownership of it. In 1703, William Penn sent his son William Penn Jr. to Philadelphia in what turned into an absolute disaster. William Penn Jr. hated Pennsylvania, got into a physical fight with local residents as well as the sheriff, and was soon sent back to England within months. William Penn Jr. also ran up huge gambling debts, which William Penn Sr. was forced to pay off, plunging him into further debt. William Penn Jr. would end up being a complete disappointment to his father, and William Penn Sr. would attempt to disinherit him. This is not unlike the relationship Admiral Penn had with his son. By 1705, Bridget Ford finally decided to probate Philip Ford's will in court, and it was essentially a public humiliation for William Penn when it was discovered just how deeply in debt he was. Penn was thrown into the Fleet Prison in 1708. Although he was eventually released, this whole fiasco left him a broken man. While Penn was fighting his legal battles over the control of Pennsylvania and his debt issues, Penn had suffered a series of strokes over the course of a few years. None of them were that serious until he had one in 1712. From 1712 until his death 6 years later in July 1718, Penn was essentially an invalid. In first-hand accounts, it was said that Penn repeated himself and that his language was very confused. In another account, it was said that his, quote, memory was quite lost and the use of his understanding was suspended. After William Penn passed away on July 20th, 1718, he was buried in Jordan's Cemetery. His wife Hannah managed his affairs from 1712 onward, and she's not given enough credit for how she was able to turn things around. By the time of her death, not only had she managed to get Penn out of debt, she managed to regain control of Pennsylvania, and she also won a court case against William Penn Jr., who had attempted to contest the will. The Penn family would continue to hold on to Pennsylvania until the American Revolution in 1776. So just a few more tidbits. There is virtually nothing left today that is from Penn's time here in America. To highlight that, this is the only verified structure in existence today that Penn is known to have visited. It is known as the Caleb Posey House, and you can see that here. It's in Chester, Pennsylvania. In the mid-1800s, they thought they had saved William Penn's original house here on the left that you can see, that he lived in from his first visit to America in 1682. So they went ahead and they tore down the slate roof house, pictured here on the right, in 1867, which was an actual verified Penn residence. Turned out the original building was not built until 1707, well after Penn had lived here, so they destroyed the only standing building that Penn did actually live in. I did want to talk briefly about the document that you see here. This is an original land grant that I acquired at auction that is signed by William Penn in 1681 to a Richard Worrell. I was actually able to locate this land on Thomas Holmes's map that you can see right there, and this was actually land where the very first Quaker anti-slavery document was held. It is very likely that this document was brought to America from England by Richard Worrell in 1682 aboard the same fleet of ships that brought William Penn here. So I thought that that is pretty interesting. So finally, I will leave you with this. Earlier this year, the National Park Service planned to take down a William Penn statue in Welcome Park, which is the site of the slate roof house. There was such a fury over it from the public that the governor of Pennsylvania actually got involved and even talked with the president and got the decision reversed. I just think that it's interesting how, despite it being 323 years since William Penn was here, that the love for him as the founder of Pennsylvania has not really faded.